Hi, folks. I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performing at our best when it matters the most and applying knowledge under pressure. I'm super excited to welcome our guest for this episode, Sarah Gebauer. Sarah is a physician who is board certified in anesthesiology and palliative medicine. She's the founder of Validara Health, I hope I pronounced that right, where she works with the healthcare companies to design rigorous evaluations for clinical AI products. She also leads AI evaluations at MDCalc. She's led an AI evaluation for national security risks at RAND, fellow Randite, and we agreed ahead of time that that's the right word for that. So hopefully anybody else listening from RAND agrees with us, but we have a quorum of two. And she's published on evaluation methodology in Nature and BMJ. And Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. We had a fun, cold reach out on LinkedIn to be like, I like your stuff. I'd love to talk to you about it. We have so many things in common in history, and I'm honored to have you here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And, since I have been a fan of the show, I have listened previously. So it was a treat to get that cold LinkedIn reach out.
So cool. Can you give folks sort of a high level overview of what you do and how you spend your time these days? It sounds like there's a lot of different buckets that falls into. And I think there's going to be some super interesting stuff here about AI, about decision making under pressure. But let's just who are you and what do you do as a start?
Yeah, I have had so much fun in my career. So I have gotten to do such cool things. Basically, got really into AI in 2022 or so. We were on sabbatical as a family, and it was the first time I got to really think about what I was interested in, and just thought it was so cool that
Mm,
machines could learn language, and taught myself everything I could. I already knew how to code from some previous clinical informatics degree, and started talking to other doctors. What are you doing? How are you incorporating this? Mostly they said they were really lonely. And so I started a group to get together stuff. We're talking about AI, and many of them have gone on to now be leaders in their health systems on AI. And so started writing a Substack on healthcare AI, now focused mostly on governance and evaluation. And started then shortly after that, I started working at RAND doing AI model evaluations for national security risks, mostly
mm,
biosecurity. Then started to translate that into healthcare. And a lot of it is fairly easily translatable into healthcare. There are a lot of unknowns, a lot of things are uncertain. You can't eliminate risk completely, no matter what you do. Very similar to, both in biosecurity and in healthcare, we all know that no matter how well we plan and try and do everything, there are still going to be bad things that happen. But we do need to make some kind of concerted effort to at least think about what those might be and mitigate them when we can. And that's the real underlying piece of it. Over the last few years, it's been interesting to watch healthcare systems grow in terms of their AI governance approaches. So, when I started doing this, people were really like, wow, we have a lot of papers that we need to file somewhere. And so they're really at that, okay, how do we talk to the legal department about this? Because we never had talked to them about this. And then now they signed off. We don't know where to put that check mark and how to handle that. And now they've really grown a lot. And now most of them have more established AI governance programs. Those take a lot of different forms. Some of them are integrated into IT systems. Some of them are integrated into a specific AI bucket. Some of them have been diffused into kind of the usual service line technique that most committee structures and hospitals adhere to. And they've gotten more mature in terms of what they're testing for also. So they started out with usually these 100 questions, surveys of, what are you doing and what kind of data are you training on and on and on. And they've really tried to streamline because they got a huge backlog of hundreds of different vendors. And then also just kind of figure out what is important. And then a
mm.
lot of training for their staff around what should you be looking for when you review these. So a lot of learning, I think, on both sides over time. So a lot of what I've done traditionally is help companies go through that governance process
Mm.
and some of the questions, think about how their current processes are and what they need to change in order to make them compatible with what a hospital is going to want. And also how to talk to the hospital leaders about what they're doing. A lot of times the engineers are doing really great, what they consider just regular QA testing, which doctors would consider like, okay, now we know that this actually works and we have more trust and faith in it because of these tests that you're doing.
Mm.
But a lot of times that translation of the engineers doing their processes doesn't get to the client success people who are, the
Yeah.
salespeople that are actually filling out these surveys. A lot of that translation work. And then now increasingly, I do a lot of technical AI evaluation work. So that means that I figure out what kinds of evaluations need to be run, what kind of metrics should you be looking at, what are the public benchmarks that make sense, what kind of custom benchmarks or metrics do you need to be looking at? And then also, how do you incorporate that into your engineering team? So how do you make sure that the engineers don't put something into production that could be clinically dangerous or could have clinical risks that they don't appreciate because they just haven't ever been in a hospital?
Sure.
It's interesting. So a lot of those risks, some of them are the obvious things, like computers making something up and it's wrong. And, but a
Sure.
lot of the bigger risks that are harder for non-clinical people to see are the system risks. And
Yeah.
as physicians, I think we all understand that redundancy is part of the system, and it's a feature, not a bug a lot of times. So we're in our push for efficiency. Sometimes we try to take out a human, which is sometimes great and very appropriate, but also means that maybe there's not an extra set of eyes on things as we as doctors, for example, have relied on for our entire careers. So keeping an eye out for those kinds of more systems related harm is increasingly, especially as we learn more about what the likely failure modes of AI itself by itself in a vacuum are, we're able to predict those better, but the system ones we're still not quite as sophisticated about.
And there's like 6,000 things I want to go into from that. There's yes, but okay, I'm gonna throw a couple stakes in the ground and then we'll sort of like weave our way through them a little bit. One is, and maybe we'll start here. So I'm gonna say this, and we'll come back to it. It is a level setting of what is governance versus evaluation? What does that mean at a level that people can feel and understand? So let's bucket that for a second. And then a couple of other waypoints are, as you're talking about this concept of like mapping the underlying analytics of a system and translating that to the folks that are using it to build that trust. And so we're talking about trust across silos, and we're talking about trust for people that have, frankly, as clinicians, really hard times trusting other people that aren't us, even us, right? Even like the number of jokes that are like, oh, the anesthetist and the ER doctor gets together and like they immediately hate each other for whatever reason, right? Like just because like we're so siloed and we're so clannish in medicine, and almost our only way around that is like, well, at least we all went to medical school, right? And that's sort of like the only reason we trust each other at all sometimes. So how do we do that with like these really interesting systems that maybe we don't totally understand, or maybe they're built by people that are coming from different pathways and different threads, and we have to somehow figure out a way to trust them. And then the third bucket, which like, man, if we get to all three buckets, that's amazing, but we'll see, is this concept of like the hidden complexity of the systems that we operate in, right? And how much the entire healthcare system relies on some guy named Jim who's in some office you've never heard of. That's the only one who keeps that one part working upon which the whole system rests. And if you efficiency Jim out of the picture, like, whoops, the entire hospital falls apart. Like the number of stories about things that just like can't happen overnight because Jim's not there or whatever it is. Like it's just such a real version of our system. So, okay, that's a lot. There's a lot of places to go from there. Maybe we start with the level setting. What is governance? What is evaluation? And how do people start connecting to this from a real life way?
Yeah, great question. And this is something that comes up. This is a new field. AI governance
Sure.
and AI evaluation is new. I think a lot of it has similarities to QA, to traditional quality work that clinicians might do, or QA work that engineers might do. A lot of that falls into a kind of similar bucket, which is basically, does this tool do what we think it's going to do? And are there times where it fails and causes some big problem? And, obviously in medicine, we're always worried about some big problem being someone dying, but it could be any number of ways that it could fail. It could say something that it's not supposed to say. If you're chatting with a patient, for example, it could tell you to show up at a certain time for an appointment when there's no appointment time. It doesn't have to be, those stakes don't have to be quite that high, but you do want to make sure that it's generally working and that that the quality of care doesn't change when you insert this into the system. So the evals are the actual metrics. So what are you looking at? You're looking at, how many times will it tell you that the appointment time is the wrong time out of 100? How many times will it give the wrong clinical advice? Or will it suggest differential diagnoses that don't make any sense? Those are the actual metrics that you're looking at. Governance is a bigger picture. So it's the circle around that. Evaluations are one circle inside the big circle of governance. So governance are the processes that you put in place to look at a tool before you put it into practice in your particular hospital. Because I work in a rural hospital. We, for example, don't have any platelets in our hospital normally. We don't have any pediatric ICU doctors, kids who are intubated can't stay at our hospital. So there are these small things that you have to
Sure.
make sure are adapted for your system. And then it also includes things like workforce training. So do people know how to use the AI tools appropriately? Have they been trained? What is your system for when something goes wrong? How do you deal with that? What's your incident response? What is your patient privacy? And, you're not just
Yep.
HIPAA, as we know, increasingly, AI tools can re-identify a lot of patient information. So, how are you going above and beyond to protect patient data and making sure that's appropriate? So it's all those pieces go into the whole governance picture. You need to have a policy. You need to have a person who makes sure the policy is being followed. All that really boring stuff that makes the world go round it makes up the big governance picture.
Got it. So we have governance as our total set of policies of how we operate a system, and then within that we have evals, which are particular readouts or metrics that we put onto a thing. And I think most of us who work in medicine in one form or another recognize that structure, right? Because that's the same structure that we're going through when we're saying, okay, hey, the ER wants to do ultrasounds now. Great. What's the governance picture around that? Who's going to run it? What does QA look like? What's the multidisciplinary body that gets together to sort through it? And how are we going to know it's working, right? What are the readouts we're going to put onto the system? And then from sort of a tighter view on the fractal curve there, right? This is how we approach resuscitation a lot, right? So what is our plan for this whole human system? How are we going to know it's working? What are the evals we're going to do? What's our thesis? And it's nice to have that sort of intuitive sense of that, I think, from folks in our world. I'm curious about, we're no stranger to metrics and evals in medicine, for better and for worse, right? And I think like one of the things that we're bumping into is the types of metrics that are, or rather, what are the types of evals that are useful and appropriate in this sense versus the ones that maybe look like they are from the outside? And we have all this history of that, right? We have the idea of never infections, like you can never have a central line infection, which is a bad thing, but it creates this culture where you can't report it, where you can't dig into it, where you can't learn from it, versus like the whatever that metric was from a while ago, that's anybody with sepsis has to have 30 cc's of crystalloid per kilogram within the first whatever, and you get dinged if they don't. You're constantly writing, oh, but this person has heart failure, so I can't do that. And if you've practiced medicine, you know what I'm saying, even though I'm sort of fumbling my way around it because I haven't had enough coffee this morning. Like, metrics are not always the right answer, but we need them. So how do we balance that tension in this space?
Oh, it's such a great question. And it's something that the field is still really struggling with. I think what I always tell non-clinical people is, look, we've been doing medicine for a long, long time, thousands of years. And every hospital still has a mortality and morbidity conference every week, every 2 weeks. Stuff still goes wrong. There are still bad things that happen. We still are trying to figure out how to decrease the bad things that happen. This idea that we're suddenly going to get to zero problems with or without AI involved that's not realistic. I do think that medicine is unique amongst industries and that we have this culture. Let's at least look that we did. Say I have a new intern and I don't know this person, like you're saying. How do you create trust with this intern who they're practicing under your medical license? If something bad happens to the patient, that is terrible for the patient and also probably terrible for you
Sure.
because you're financially and legally liable for that bad thing. And so how do you build that trust? How do you figure out what that intern knows, what that intern doesn't? And so a lot of our skills as physicians in terms of working with either junior residents or, in a new situation, a new setting, in an interprofessional way, when I, go to a new hospital, what do the nurses do there regularly?
Sure.
And there's at other hospitals, it may be completely different. And so a lot of that still applies. So we ask them questions. We figure out, we try to find where the edges of their knowledge are and ask. And this is a skill that attendings build up over time. And I expect that as we use AI more and more, we as a society will also build this more. The more you use AI, I certainly build my knowing where the edges of AI capability are and where to expect failures. But we ask the really important questions. So did you do that? Did you check to make sure they are having urine output? Did you look in their throat to make sure that they didn't have an infection? So these kind of things, we ask the really important questions. We're actually quite good at that. And that's, I think, an important thing to remember for doctors to remember is that we have this skill already and you just can translate it.
Yeah, I've never thought of the relationship with AI in the same parallel structure as guiding a new intern or medical student, but I think that makes a lot of sense. It relies, though, on me having enough, or whoever the attending is in this picture, having enough depth of expertise to know what's critical, and then having enough sensor nets out there to see something before the failure happens. And I think those are both questions rather than like we are guaranteed to have those.
Absolutely. And the other really interesting piece to that is that I can't see an intern's decision process,
Sure.
or I can't have an intern who I can look back later and look at every single thing they did that day and why and what source of information they pulled it from, and every single piece. But we can do that now with AI. So our traceability for AI is
Mm,
observability is far better than it was several weeks ago. Sometimes we
sure.
don't know why it gives a particular answer, but especially as we work more
Mhm.
with agents and RAG databases, which are basically, big sources of verified information that we want the tool to go and look at. Did it did it give you an answer just from its general training, or did it go look at this database? We at least can look at that. So we
Sure.
have now access to different kinds of information about the tools that we're working with, whether they are humans or
Mhm.
computers. And we don't totally know yet how to use that increased amount of information to produce an outcome that is better than the ones we already have.
Yeah.
So I think part of M&M and M&M conferences, what were you thinking or what was happening at the time? And we actually can figure that out pretty well now with AI. So we have much more data about that piece, which is actually a little kind of reassuring. And we can, unlike humans, we can ram the machine to not do that exact thing nearly as much in the future. And so those are actually, you can create some safeguards within that AI framework that you don't have every year. There's a Methergen is supposed to be given IM during if there's bleeding after a delivery, for example. So it's supposed to be intramuscular Methergen every year. People, new interns give it IV every single year. And this is despite being told multiple times, do not give it IV.
Mhm.
And it just happens year after year. So those kind of things are actually a little more preventable, which is great
Mm,
with AI in some ways, because you can put hard stops on some of the things that you see happening. The downside is that we don't know how AI is going to fail and how it's going to fail
yeah.
differently. So at the outset, which
Yeah.
is where we are now, guessing we are just guessing where the problems are probably going to be. And a lot of times we're basing that on where the humans have problems, which is probably not where the AI is going to have problems. Humans and AI have different failure modes fundamentally. And so we also are trying to figure out, until we have a larger corpus, where should we be testing? And so I think that gets to your point in terms of how do we figure this out? I think more
Mhm.
longer this goes on, the more data we'll have and the better we'll get at it. But we're not going to start from where we are with M&Ms, and there's so many human failure studies, and knowing we know so much about how medicine fails from a human standpoint now. And with AI, we just don't have that corpus of information yet.
We know so much about how humans fail, and we still continue to put them in situations where failure is likely and even the most likely outcome of what happens, right? And I think we're still sort of coming to grips with that knowledge and moving, as it were, away from the mythical doctor as hero to doctor as participant in a complex system, and the like resulting redesign of thought process and identity sense that comes with that. And yeah, it's really interesting, that concept that AIs, like all systems have failure modes. AIs will have failure modes that is different than what we are used to seeing and what we understand. And it's like, in some sense, it's like that, the story of like the drunk with the street light, right? Like the person's drunk and they're looking for their keys and they're looking under the street light. Why are you looking there? Oh, it's because that's where it's light. I'm gonna look for what I know. But we just put this out on medRxiv like yesterday or the day before, but it's this cross model benchmark of frontier models looking at potential stroke symptoms and basically asking them, what, like, hey, I'm a person who woke up with this symptom in my arm. What do I do? I'll stress this is a preprint, by the way, before I keep going. But anyway, and we had all these models run through it, and almost none of them called 911, which is a problem. But there was actually a couple things in there that were really fascinating as we think about failure modes, right? So one is they keyed really tightly on the word used to describe the symptom. So heavy was not the same as weak, was not the same as clumsy. And that's probably not related to how human beings actually think. But the truth is, we don't know how human beings describe their stroke-like symptoms. We don't know a lot of this stuff. So that's sort of like one whole ball of wax. The other thing is they didn't call 911, which is a real problem. But if you look at the studies of what humans do, about 40% of the time they drive themselves to the ER. So I was curious, would the AI models pick to drive themselves to the ER, reflecting what humans do? But they don't. They never, not in any one of our runs of thousands of different things, did they choose to drive themselves to the ER. So now you have a model that is not a paragon of what you should do. And it's also not directly reflective of what human beings do. And it's just such an interesting thing that it's doing its own set of mistakes. And to walk into this trying to probe, well, what's it going to be, and have it come up with a third answer I'd never thought of before was a really fascinating outcome of this. And I don't know, the paper's fun and y'all should read it and tell me what you think. But aside from that, just this idea of, look, it's not going to break like human brains do. And I think that's even more true when we get into stress and pressure, right? The way like we're training a lot of these systems on calm human thinking, and then we're using it in situations which are not calm, right? There's sick people who are stressed and angry and upset, and the chemical soup that's floating around in our brain is causing us to make different decisions and altering everything down to the level of like the fundamental speed accuracy trade-off of identification things in our brain. So we're in this crazy new space trying to create, as you're describing, systems of government and trust around it, governance and trust around it that allow us to use it for the good parts and put some bumpers up in the bowling lane of where it's going to fail.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make such a good point about the being under pressure piece. My understanding of the data is that a lot of what we do is take in information. We take in a lot of visual information, and a lot of information we hear, and so we have many senses through which we take in this information. I remember I had a patient once that came in for an EGD, and he came down from had been admitted for a different reason to the hospital, came down for an EGD. He was having some just a stomach upset kind of thing. And I called the attending and I said, yeah, I don't know. He just looks bad. I don't know. He says he's fine. He's just burping. He's probably nothing, but just want to make sure you guys aren't worried about anything else. And they were like, oh, his troponin just came back positive. Like, please send him back upstairs. He should not have been brought down. And I had nothing, no data to go on. All. And I'm not saying that I am like a spectacular doctor. My point is that I am getting so many visual cues that AI can't get yet. If you look at a lot of the AI that are getting the most funding right now, they're world model companies, which they're trying to figure out how to give the AI access to the hundreds of data points that you and I get when we walk by a patient's room. I live in a ski town. So when I walk by a patient's room, if a patient's bone is sticking out in top of their ski boot, I'm pretty sure what's happening there. And I don't know more information, but the AI looking at just whatever information's in the chart has no idea that that's happening. And the same, you walk by, they have their legs crossed, reading a paper versus they're writhing in pain versus clasping their chest. You get so much information that at this point, at least, in the future, I think it'll be different, but right now, they just don't have access to. And so they're going to make, aside from the fact that the way that they pattern match, which is how they make decisions, is different than how humans do that, they also just are missing this huge chunk of information that especially experienced clinicians really rely on. I mean, I think we all, especially if we get a certain point out of residency, really rely on our kind of, that he looks bad or looks good, really sway our judgment in terms of whether to send him out or keep him, for better or worse.
Did you ever read the Klein-Kahneman paper, A Failure to Disagree?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I can't count the number of times we've talked about this on this podcast in one form or another, but the basic question is like, are you operating in a universe where developing expertise is possible or not within the microcosm that you find yourself in? And that, I mean, I think we all viscerally felt that especially during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when folks would come in and behave in ways which were just totally antithetical to what we thought was possible. Right? I mean, sitting there having a conversation with you satting at 40, and you're like, okay, I don't know what this is, right? And I think that reliance on expertise, which is tacit and difficult to quantify, and even if I could give an AI system access to everything I'm thinking and feeling, I don't even know what it is half the time, right? Such a fun, interesting, fascinating problem to get to work with that and to see as that surface boundary evolves over time, like where the systems are making more or less human-like or hopefully superhuman-like decision making about that. But and maybe this is a good time to pivot from governance through to trust. So, man, what do we do with that, right? Like, how do you take a system that's evolving that doesn't think the way that you and I do, that is, doing, I get to say this now on a podcast, which is fun, partially observable Markov decision-making processes. I always wanted to say that on a podcast, just throw that out there. I know it's not exactly what it is for purists out there, but whatever. So it's partially observable the way it makes decisions. And this is fun. I get to nerd out on this podcast. It's great. It's partially observable, not totally observable, and it lives within a system that it can somewhat touch, but not totally. So we have these governance systems around it, but how do we learn to trust that? How do we integrate that like really truly into clinical work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are starting to be more studies about human computer interactions that are trying to answer this because it's very interesting in terms of when and how you present information to people and in what setting to clinicians in terms of whether they accept suggestions or decline them.
Sure.
So I'm sure you've seen some of these, and radiology is the best studied, but I think particularly in situations where there is time pressure, lot pressure, that is not quite as well studied, and
Sure.
how people accept the information and incorporate it into their thinking in a meaningful way. Because if at least for radiologists, if you give them an answer too early, they just go with whatever the AI says,
Mhm.
and if you incorporate it and make it really hard to figure out what the AI was actually saying by, trying to make them think more, then they just kind of ignore it completely. So there are different approaches that are being tried, and none is totally true yet.
Yeah.
I do think that part of it is a lot of what I see for the governance plan is there's a physician in the loop or a clinician in the
Mhm.
loop, or on the loop is now what people are saying. So basically,
Sure.
there's a clinician who's involved who is incorporating the output before it actually reaches a patient. And that is kind of the check mark of, okay, well, as long as the human's looking at it before it gets to the patient, then it's fine. I am not totally on board with that because I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of humans are a fallible system. We are very fallible. We make mistakes all the time. We know it's well documented. You can also ask my kids. They will give you great documentation of all my mistakes. But we're putting a system that has unknown failure modes and layering it on top of a known failure mode
Mhm.
system, and then expecting the combination of those two to make then a perfect decision. And
Huh.
to me, doesn't really compute. And so I am worried that the liability piece, which especially in the U.S. is such an issue for clinicians.
Sure.
At this point, at least, it's all in the physicians. My personal feeling is that it should not be, because these are tools that are being introduced by the health system, that are, the
Yeah.
physicians actually have no input on using, and are often not well trained to use and to know what the advantages and disadvantages and where to look for the possible failures for a particular tool. And that just is not a really fair way to put somebody into a very high liability situation. But I think that's the future, is how do
Mm.
you look at those human computer interactions and decrease risk and increase the actual care to our patients. That's what we're all trying to do. At the end of the day is, let's just take better care of people. And we want to be able to know how to do that in a meaningful way. And I believe that has huge potential if we do it right.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting interface here with the concepts from the nudge part of the universe, right? Like, how do you present a decision to a human drastically influences the way we make that decision. And for anybody listening to this who's had the experience of trying to advise a patient on whether or not TPA is a good choice for a potential stroke, has lived this very vividly, right? And I remember doing that all the time as a resident. And then, I found myself working in a very small rural hospital overnight one night, and I was the only doctor in the hospital. And, so now all of a sudden I'm glancing through, like doing my ER doctor job, reading the head CT, oh, there's no large bleed. Okay, so like, how do I advise this family? And there's no time to reach anybody else. And the way you frame it really matters. So I think I don't know if this is like if this falls under cybernetics or what it falls under, but sort of the thought process of like, how do you design human AI interfaces that are knowledgeable about humans and that adjust to the moment of what's happening, right? So right now, just from a very basic standpoint, our chief output mode of a lot of these models is like this long, lengthy text, like whatever it is, but nobody has time for that. If you're in the middle of a case and your patient's heart rate's dropping and you're figuring out what to do, you can't read an essay about it any more than I can in the ER. So, and that's not even talking about the actual changes in our like neuroanatomy that happen with stress and how that influences our ability to process or think through things. But I think there's a pretty undiscovered arc here about how we can actually we said it earlier, like we don't want to put people in situations where failure is the likely outcome. So what does that system have to look like to help people succeed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually so getting back to referencing back to metrics, that is a metric that I always look at whenever I work with companies, because yes, it's like you get a novel, and if that's not it may be appropriate for a very rare disease where you're trying to make a very complex diagnosis, but definitely not for a lot of hospital-based situations. And so that's part of the thing with, we have to work closely with our engineering colleagues to make sure that they understand what we're actually trying to do. In terms of how do you incorporate the system, I think the best outline that we have for this, again, is working with interns and residents. So we take very inexperienced people and give them increasing, we have expectations for what they should be able to do. And then we don't expect them to really go beyond those expectations. So we kind of know what a intern can do, what a resident can do, what a fellow can do. And we don't really allow them to go above that unless they prove themselves over time to be exceptional. We do have a way to incorporate relatively, the other thing I'll say is like, look, doctors are good at dangerous tools. We got scalpels, we got drills, we got all kinds, that if you don't know how to use them, they are quite dangerous. But if you have the training and the background, and you know what to avoid, right? Like a surgeon knows what vessels to avoid. When I'm doing a nerve block, I know what nerves to go around, what blood vessels to go around. We know this stuff, and it's very similar with AI in a lot of ways, where and with interns the same, like, what they're likely to not do. What questions that you need to ask. And I think as we incorporate AI, we're going to together have to kind of learn what those boundaries are exactly. One hard part right now is that there are so many AI tools in hospitals. Many large health systems will have 400 tools. That doesn't mean one clinician has access to 400 tools, but there's a lot of stuff, and the churn rate is very high. You may have one year and then they switch to another one, and that might be slightly different in terms of what it's likely to be bad at. And so I think in that way, it's a little harder because we haven't settled on, okay, there's this kind of baseline level of capability of each of the tools. I think we're getting there as the foundation models get better. But at least for the last few years, it's been like some of them are just so dumb sometimes. And you're like, come on, like have super intelligence in terms of protein folding. When I was doing chemistry lab in college, and it took me 6 months to figure out how a protein folded, and now that happens in 3 seconds. You could do that, but then you can't. That for a long time, it couldn't tell you how many R's were in the letter strawberry. You have to have some kind of consistency in like failure modes across tools, which I think we're getting to, but haven't quite gotten to yet, to be able to anticipate how to incorporate them into a safe plan of care for your patient.
I have this very vivid memory of being in medical school on my anesthesia rotation, and it was like my first day with this new fellow, and I'm working underneath him, and he's like, "Great, go ahead and like draw whatever this is up and inject it into this, and we're gonna drip it." And I immediately stabbed myself. Like within 1 second, he like handed me a needle, turned around, and I was like, and I had like just stabbed, not my finest moment as anything, honestly. And I just remember like the sheer disappointment on his face, in large part because I had made his life harder, but also like because he was like, okay, well, I can't teach you anything else now because you've just tripped over yourself on like the first second of this. And I think in some ways, like that's what we're running into with this. We're running into the strawberry problem where we're like, okay, you're an idiot. Why did you just do that? But also, that means that we now can't necessarily do this next really amazing, life-changing thing that you're going to go do. And I think there's a balance in there. I love this idea of what are the basic things that we have to have a system be capable of doing and proving that it can do. Although all this fun research coming out about how good they are at cheating on benchmarks is kind of interesting. But put that aside for a second, right? What are the things that we want it to be able to do before we can get it into spaces where we can really, really dig into it? Yeah. There also, thank you if you're listening to this. You know who you are for not kicking me out of the whole program that day. Just telling me to go wash my hands off and then come back.
We still have you here with us as a
It's
grad
great.
position.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. We're coming to, I mean, like, first off, I could keep doing this forever. Like, there's so many interesting pieces in here, but we're coming to the end of some time here. And I want to give you a chance to issue a challenge to everybody listening to this. So, something you want them to do differently, AI related or not, thinking about failure modes or humans or whatever as they're walking away from this. And to give you a little time to stall, I'm going to issue a normal disclaimer, which is that everything we do here on the podcast is to take the best of what people have already learned and bring it back to the public. Nothing we do is medical advice, and nothing we do represents the people we work for or with. It's just two humans out here trying to make the world a better place. Potentially in the future, two humans and some AIs out here in the world trying to make the world a better place. But with that, Sarah, what do you want to leave folks with? What do you want them to do differently when they come away?
This is what I always say to physicians is that this is new for everybody. Get involved. You're smart. If you're listening to this podcast and interested in this stuff, then you are smart and curious enough to be a huge asset to the field. And we need more smart people thinking about how to incorporate AI in our medical system and how to make it safe. And not just even our medical system, our society, and all the systems that we interact with. We want it to realize these amazing possible gains. And if we don't have domain experts working very closely in the fields, we're going to get really subpar products. The engineers are incredible, but if they don't have knowledge of exactly what we need, and to your point, where it needs to be and how it needs to exactly work and how it needs to elicit trust and provide information, then we're not going to see the kind of improvements that we all hope to see. So that would be my challenge, is to just raise your hand, get involved some way or another. Don't be intimidated. This is new for engineers too. Engineers are learning all this AI stuff also at the same time we are. So don't feel like it's just out of your field. It's going to be all of our fields to some point or another. We need to have some kind of basic literacy in AI.
Love it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for digging into this with me, and thank you for everything that you're doing.
Oh, it's been such a treat. I've really enjoyed the conversation.